Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 26 cheat sheet. What I find so interesting about this game week is that this is potentially the last week where you can make a flexible move, but also an aggressive move before Game Week 27, where we'll actually find out the outcomes of the FA Cup games and know a little bit more about blank Game Week 29. Another thing to think about too, of course, is depending on whatever chip strategy you're pursuing, your move should try to be reflective of whatever you have in mind. Let's say you're planning for free at 29. Let's say you're planning for free at 34. You want to be thinking about those fixtures in mind. But of course, our understanding of those fixtures will only be really solidified on game week 27. So that's why I think that you can make an aggressive move this week, such as going for a Wolves or Man United player in general, just because they have such great fixtures in the short term, or even an Arsenal player, of course. Or you can, let's say, take a slightly more conservative approach. Let's say you're planning for free at 34 already. You don't have much expectations for cup upsets. Therefore, of course, you can actually go for an Aston Villa player or a West Ham player as well. So as I said, the strategy choice right now this week is quite diversified. You can basically go any direction you want, but I still think that there's a lot of upside in just taking on what is an amazing fixture here with Sheffield United home, particularly if you're interested in Wolves assets. So let's get straight to the video. In terms of those sort of cheap tier picks in the midfield, we have Hwang getting a rise. We also have Neto getting a rise. And the simple reality here is if you look at, for example, Wolves' fixtures 2 out of 3, and in general, the sort of longer, wider run, if you plan to keep one of these players within your team, is that they're amazing. And Sheffield United at home, you really can't ask for a better fixture right now in the league. Fulham at home in the distance is also very good. And another little thing about Wolves too is they still have a small chance, right, of being able to play in Game Week 29. Let's say Bournemouth lose to Leicester, and we expect a team like Wolves to lose to Brighton within the FA Cup. If that can happen, then you'll get these Wolves players playing in Game Week 29 versus Bournemouth at home. So that's a very nice fixture to have if it happens. And so that's why, of course, Hwang and Neto rise. I just think that the short-term fixtures are amazing. And Hwang and Neto are still players that right now, with let's say Cunha's injury, that I would guarantee really good minutes and not really having any fears about. So I really like them as transfers. At the same time, of course, you can see that the competing picks are Garnacho and Douglas Luiz. And the simple reality, too, is that Garnacho has really good fixtures. He actually has a higher likelihood of not having a blank Game Week 29, but that depends on how Man United perform versus Nottingham Forest away from home. And then with Douglas Luiz, of course, you have the full safety knowing that he will play in Game Week 29. He's got a good fixture in Game Week 26, and he's also got a good fixture in Game Week 30. As far as the next tier of the midfielders here, we don't have too many changes. It's just Doku falling, but quickly just going back a step, I've also added Bailey having a rise and also Palmer having a fall. In my opinion, that's more symptomatic of the fixture landscape. You can see Palmer, of course, we have expected blanks. We also have a blank on Game Week 26. With Bailey, of course, you just have more fixtures than the rest of the field. So he becomes a little bit more of an intriguing pick, particularly if, let's say, you don't like Douglas Luiz, you think he's boring as a pick, or you don't like backing an asset like that, who's just on set pieces, who's on penalties as well, which, of course, is a very valid route to FPL points. Bailey's your quintessential opposite archetype of that player. He's an open field player. He is going to get you that open field XGI, and he could very well do well outside of pure set piece action. So that's the sort of state of affairs there. With Doku, I think he gets a fall. Unfortunately, it seems like even with the Grealish injury, we are still seeing less Doku minutes than expected. And part of that, of course, is Oscar Bob. He has played well enough in certain minutes where you'd say Doku, of course, would be better for this, or better served for this Man City team. Still, though, Doku was able to clock more minutes than KDB. I don't exactly know what's going on with KDB. Maybe that was a very specific managed rest, and maybe he's been overloaded recently with the sort of amount of minutes he's actually played. And of course, we have to sort of downgrade KDB when you look later down the list. But with the sort of next tier of midfielders, we have Richarlison with a drop here. Part of this, I think, is simply there's a blank, but then also you have to think about, once again, free at 29 comes into play, right? So when you're evaluating Spurs players, try to think about the possibility of keeping a Spurs player on your bench, because it might actually help you out within the short term. If you can, let's say, bench Richarlison for this week, you can still look at him as a great option for Game Week 27. You can still look at him as a great option for Game Week 29 as well. So I don't think Richarlison is necessarily someone who's going to fall off the map as a pick. Yes, of course, he was substituted off early at around 72 minutes in the previous game, but the reality too with, let's say, a team like Spurs is that the substitutions are going to have very varied patterns. And you could see some games where Richarlison, like in the past, has played 90 minutes. He could also play 70 minutes. I think 70 minutes is more around the low threshold. But of course, if there's ever a situation where we see Richarlison get benched, then of course that's going to be a huge red flag for him as a pick. And that's something that we still need to look for in the future. As far as Bowen, it's a similar case to a pick like Douglas Luiz, where in the short term, he's just amazing, right? You've got Brentford fixtures, Burnley fixtures, and also, of course, a fixture in Game Week 29 to boot. So My issue with Bowen, of course, is when you look at some of the peers in the position right now in terms of the expected goal involvement per 90, he clearly lacks a little bit of firepower. And he doesn't have, for example, something like a double game week. But of course, having an additional game week over the rest of the field just might be enough to guarantee Bowen being a good pick. The concern that I would say, of course, is that when you look at some of the players within the cheaper positions, it does feel like Bowen can be matched from a firepower perspective, and that is a bit concerning. And so that's why I think I wouldn't necessarily go all in on Bowen. In fact, if let's say you want to go for a West Ham pick and you're bored of Douglas Luiz, I think Ward-Prowse is sort of the exact replica of that for a slightly more expensive price. But you've got access to penalties there and some set pieces. So that's something to think about in terms of whether you really want to invest that much money into someone like Bowen. Does he really satisfy your strategy? And is he a long-term pick? That's the question that you might want to ask yourself. As far as Luis Diaz, he gets a fall. Even though actually his minutes technically have been enhanced, the issue, of course, is you've got Game Week 28 on the horizon as well, which is a City game, which is going to be tough. On top of that, too, you could argue that, let's say, Liverpool losing a bit of firepower is always going to hurt their overall attacking ceiling. But I think the biggest concern, obviously, is still our expectations that Liverpool will beat Southampton in the FA Cup, and therefore that will mean a Game Week 26 blank and a Game Week 29 blank as well for Luis Diaz. So that's why he falls. With Odegaard, I think he gets a rise. With Arsenal, I think what's interesting is we're still looking for a lot of transfers in for some players. So let's say you're planning to take Palmer out, you're planning to take Jota out. The players that you actually probably want to bring in is someone like Odegaard, because even though he has a high chance of blanking Game Week 29, there are not many players within the game right now that have 3 perfect fixtures in a row. I think Gross is one of those players. Odegaard is definitely one of those players, but he also has a higher chance of actually having a fixture in Game Week 29, which is why I quite like Odegaard over Gross for the time being. Plus, of course, one of those fixtures is Sheffield United away. I just can't really overstate how good a fixture versus Sheffield United is, and so that's just something to think about right now. Plus, of course, with the form that Newcastle have shown recently, you could argue that actually all the fixtures here are generally better for, let's say, Arsenal, with exception to that Brentford one. As far as Foden, he gets a drop. I think his minutes have reached a point in for example, our understanding of Man City this season that they're amazing. And frankly, there's nothing to scoff at with his points. The question, of course, is just going to be if City blank in Game Week 29, and if one of those fixtures is going to be a tough fixture in Game Week 28, do we really value the City assets that much? And I think that is going to be something that we can call into question, right? He's not on, for example, a lot of additional set pieces. Sometimes you can see him on some left-sided set pieces. But with Foden, I think he is carrying a lot of value within our teams. If you're, let's say, planning to make a divergent chip strategy play, if you're planning, for example, something like free at 29, I think it makes a lot of sense to actually keep Foden within your team. If you're planning something else, though, let's say you're wildcarding this week or you're free hitting on 34, I do think this is a time where Foden no longer becomes such an essential, stable asset in the game. And that's the reality, right? When a double game week comes and goes, you've exhausted the player, in my opinion, of its full potential sometimes, unless they have more doubles. And he doesn't right now. He has some pretty bad fixtures on the horizon, even in spite of me saying, of course, he's a City player. And of course, they are the tough fixture. But that's just the reality of things. With Maddison, I think it's a similar situation to Richarlison, where he is a little bit more expensive compared to Richarlison. He isn't, for example, occupying ridiculous positions. He's not playing out of position. He is still on some set pieces, though. And of course, with Porro being out, that just means he's got more access to them. Of course, we've got a blank in the distance, and I think Maddison will probably rise in the future in terms of where he'll land in the cheat sheet. But of course, right now, he's just an asset to think about in the back of your mind. Do I bring him in a few weeks' time? And I think Game Week 27 or Game Week 29 is a good opportunity to do so with Maddison. With Fernandes, I've given him a rise, but I know a lot of people will say, and obviously, if you've been watching football this season, you can either argue that Fernandes has been unlucky or he's been awfully bad. And maybe the reality is somewhere in the middle. Still, though, what I would say is that he's a penalty taker. He's got good fixtures on the horizon, and he still gets into really good positions. I think the previous game versus Luton is no different. Now, of course, the one-on-one chance that, let's say, Kaminsky basically gifted him and him missing is not something you necessarily want to see as a player, but this happens from time to time, right? Football players can hit bad patches. I don't think Fernandes is going to basically be a rotten pick for the rest of time, and so you can just effectively pick a pick when they actually have good fixtures and hope to get lucky again. In my opinion, it's no different to when I went Eze versus Sheffield United at home and got a lot of good jam. You might be able to do it with Fernandes. You might not, because you might not believe in it. But I think Fernandes is a very valid pick right now, given Man United's fixtures, given the fact that they also have a pretty high probability of not having a blank in Game Week 29, depending on how they perform versus Nottingham Forest in the FA Cup. As far as the full premium tier of assets, I've given Son a rise and De Bruyne a fall. Now, De Bruyne, I'm not exactly sure what made him not appear within the Brentford game at all. As I said, there might be some question marks about De Bruyne, Is he getting managed rest? Or is it the case that, let's say, he's just been overrun recently and actually this is something where they didn't necessarily plan to rest De Bruyne, but he's actually not physically fit right now? I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but also the concern, of course, is you're carrying a pick who's very expensive and you have other players who you can guarantee right now will play 90 minutes a game. And it always comes back to this in FPL, but players who play 90 minutes every game, and you can basically rest assured that they will always outperform a player like De Bruyne, unfortunately, at the sort of stage in his career and also the sort of importance that he has in terms of managing all competitions. So if it's more likely the case that De Bruyne's going to be rested for key Champions League fixtures, key cup fixtures, or that he's going to be rested from time to time anyways as a part of his sort of process to full fitness, then of course we just have to downgrade De Bruyne as a valuable pick. And I think Son, of course, is sort of sitting there as a perfect replacement really in the short term. So I think Game Week 27, if you're a De Bruyne holder, I would keep him for Game Week 26 and then actually revisit a very simple transfer of De Bruyne to Son later down the line. With Salah, the reason why I've given him an asterisk and also not given him a rise is simply because Game Week 26 is going to be a blank. Game Week 29 is very, very likely to be a blank. And with the Man City game in the distance, I just think that, yes, of course, we saw Salah once again in his full glory, coming off the bench versus Brentford, doing his stuff. But the concern, of course, is still the minutes and exactly what this injury situation is as well. I don't know at the time of this recording whether he's going to feature versus Luton. He might be on the bench. I know Darwin's not in the squad, which is already concerning in terms of how depleted Liverpool are as a team. But of course, if Salah has re-injured himself, that's a huge point of concern, and we'll see how it gets managed. Klopp hasn't necessarily mentioned directly in his press conferences that Salah is an issue, but of course, we'll have to see what happens. Maybe we won't get an update, and he might not feature versus Luton, but we might also see what happens with Salah later down the line, and we can reassess him. Right now, my understanding of Salah is that he's probably not going to feature in Game Weeks 26 and 29. And unfortunately, of course, when you look at Game Week 28, it's not a great fixture as well. So I think this is the time to maybe consider what the wider strategy is. Liverpool are most likely going to have good fixtures from 30 and beyond. And so I think that is a good time to think about bringing Salah into your team. And maybe you can now just have a loose plan to sort of bring Salah into your team around then, as opposed to immediately going to Salah in Game Week 27. That's just my thoughts on things right now. As far as the forward position, just shifting over there, Adebayo, unfortunately, is still not going to be a part of that Liverpool squad. That's the sort of rumored news that we've been reading about Luton and that team. Of course, that makes Morris a better asset, but I think the only thing here that makes Morris and Adebayo sort of interesting picks going beyond Game Week 26 is, of course, the double game week versus Bournemouth. But not only that, just the chance that, let's say, if Man United actually beat Nottingham Forest in the FA Cup, which is still expected, and also if, let's say, City beat Luton, which is definitely expected, if that happens, of course, you're going to have a fixture for Luton on Game Week 29. So, of course, the weird thing, I suppose, is you don't necessarily need to bring in an Adebayo Morris. Now, what we can do, of course, is track their injury progress, track where, of course, Morris is going to get more guaranteed minutes as a result of this Adebayo injury, and see, of course, which forward we'd like to bring in a few weeks' time, potentially around Game Week 28 when they've got a double. So, the reason why I mentioned Game Week 28 in specific is not just because of the double, but also because it's a good opportunity to take Haaland out of your team. So Haaland, of course, I would still say is a top tier asset for now. But of course, by Game Week 28, you might actually consider that if you want to follow a one premium structure, that ultimately the move to go from, let's say, Haaland to a Luton forward could be very reasonable depending on how the fixtures fall, depending on the FA Cup results. So that's a loose strategy that I kind of want to put in people's heads because it could be an interesting point of play. Right now, I think we have a small tightening in terms of the interesting forwards within the game. I think Solanke, Højlund, Tony Watkins, and Haaland are now sort of the new frontier of the sort of best forwards that we have right now. With Darwin, I think the concern, of course, is simply this injury that's going to keep him out of this Luton fixture. And I'm, of course, super bummed about that as a Darwin owner for all this time. Not even being able to enjoy more than 45 minutes of Darwin Núñez in a double is upsetting to me. But the reality, of course, is, after this double game week has come and gone, Darwin's fixtures are awful. And of course, we have to see what's going on with his injury. With Højlund, I think the minutes are basically reaching a point where he's basically an 82 minute player. The fixtures are very good for Man United, but the question once again is, how can you afford three strikers right now? Is it not the case that we want to prioritize players like Solanke first, maybe even Tony first? And the way I see it too is, let's say if I was to think about the three best strikers in the game for the next 2 weeks, I'd still probably say it's actually going to be Haaland, Watkins, and Tony, if you actually wanted to pick three of them. And if you had the chance, of course, you have to sort of force a transfer into Game Week 28 for Solanke, right? If you don't already own Solanke right now. And that's the tough thing that makes Højlund very hard to reach as a pick, right? That Game Week 28 fixture is so good for Solanke that I just cannot conceive any manager skipping Solanke as a pick. I mean, he's even going to be a triple captaincy option for some players. Of course, rest in peace, Haaland, triple captaincy 23-24 for all of us managers who pressed the button. Wasn't exactly what we hoped for, but that's life, and that's FPL as well. The reality, though, I think is that if you can somehow, let's say, ignore, for example, Watkins, and you don't really care about Watkins, then I guess you've always got Højlund as well, and he could be an interesting pick as well. So that's, I suppose, the landscape. I still think that they're all very good. I don't think you can necessarily go wrong, but I still think that the three best going forwards is going to be 3 out of 4 between Haaland, Watkins, Solanke, and Toney. I just think that Højlund is already at that level where I don't think I can call it a miss. It just feels like it's hard to transfer in Højlund at any point in time if you own any of the 3 out of 4 that I've mentioned. And moving on to the defense now, we've also reached a point in time where once again, a lot of defenders will not play in Game Week 29. The only defenders that will actually play confirmed right now in Game Week 29 is someone like Reguilon, which is why he rises. Another player, of course, is going to be Pau, which you might be concerned about whether Pau is actually going to continue playing, right? Let's say if Konsa comes back in, if you think that Lenglet has, for example, found his way into the good books of Emery, maybe Pau Torres does actually continue to play football if Konsa comes back. Maybe, of course, it's Cash who loses his spot, and naturally we get to see Pau and Lenglet more often and Konsa back in the right back position. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I still think Pau is probably first choice, but we'll see how things develop, and that's why I've kept Pau here just at an interim position of being a yellow tier pick. With Moreno, I still think that if you look back to last season, what we did see, of course, was that Moreno was still someone who started all of the fixtures ahead of Dean. Sometimes he was subbed off early, but when I say early, it's more so between the 70th minute and the 90th minute. The concern, though, I think, is that Luca Dean did actually start the season with incredible minutes, and also, well, that's of course partly due to the Moreno injury, but also really good form. And as a manager as well, I think managers are quite reactive to form. Dean has played enough, in my opinion, and well enough where I think he could deserve a start in the future. So just like Cash, for example, has been rotated this season, I think Cash, of course, is much lower priority compared to Moreno and what he brings to the table. But it could very well be the case that we can see a little bit more of Dean in the future, and that could be something to sort of pay attention to. So that for me is the concern with Moreno. Otherwise, he would, of course, be a green tier pick, and that's that. Going back to the sort of top budget defenders, though, I just wanted to mention that Van Heck, of course, rises to the top. I think from a price point of view, getting access to the Brighton team, considering their fixtures as well, that's ludicrous. And so right now he feels like he's perma-nailed, is what I would say. Webster is someone who's lost his position in the team. Igor as well is also capable to losing, for example, minutes. And I think that's just simply the reality of this Brighton team right now. I think Van Heck and Dunk are probably your nailed defenders. Outside of that, it's very hard to call. I think Lamptey deserves minutes, but as you can see as well, he can also be subbed off at 45 minutes. Plus, he is such a volatile asset in terms of his own physical fitness that I don't really trust him. As far as Nuri, though, when you're looking at a pick like that, this is basically punting towards, once again, some really good fixtures in Game Weeks 26 and 28, and the simple reality that you might want to punt towards a Wolves pick, which I think is perfectly justifiable over a fixture period where we don't have defenders with great fixtures outside of Arsenal, right? Like, I think if you go week to week and you look at the quality defenses that we have, it's very hard to see us owning, for example, picks outside of Arsenal and thinking that they're going to get really good returns. Even, for example, a team like City will have blanks in between, will have a Liverpool fixture as well. So it's hard to guarantee, for example, that these City picks will continue to do so well as we might expect. So Pau, Ait-Nouri, these are new picks. Doughty and Botman, they both drop. Botman on the part that Newcastle, I think their just running form on defense just is unspeakably bad. And at this sort of price point, considering you have an Arsenal fixture in the distance, considering that they don't really cover key gaps within the FPL landscape, I just think that they're not that valuable. Plus, of course, I still think that Newcastle will beat Blackburn, so that probably means that Game Week 29 is going to be a blank for Newcastle. So what is the value of a Newcastle pick right now? I'm not quite sure, to be honest. And as you can see in their position in terms of the XGC rankings, very, very low, even worse than a team like Spurs, which is, that's all that I need to say. With Doughty, of course, the key thing, of course, is understanding how the FA Cup games will be managed. He gets a drop simply because there's a blank in the distance, but I actually think that Doughty can still be someone that you can keep in your team, and I would very much so wait until at least Game Week 28 or even Game Week 27 where you get the news and the confirmation whether Luton actually blank or not on Game Week 29 first before you actually think about taking him out of your team. I think probably the next opportunity to really take Doughty out of your team is Game Week 30, and you probably won't even have the transfer to do so. He'll just be someone who's sitting at the back of your bench for the rest of the time, but I think that's totally fine. As far as other movements here in terms of the sort of more premium positions, I've given White a rise, and I think part of that is because of the injuries that we've seen with Arsenal, but also I think he's sort of moved back into, once again, another position in the team where I think he's quite comfortably nailed within the team. We also know that very shortly, someone like a Timber might be coming back to the team, and whether that changes, for example, Gabriel's importance in the team, or whether that changes White's importance in the team, is something that we still need to assess. But I think right now I would still be quite comfortable that White is an interesting pick, but I would still, of course, prefer Gabriel and Saliba very clearly before White. The reality now is that Saliba is very expensive, and White, of course, could be someone that you could save a little bit of money with. As far as Ake, he gets a drop. Unfortunately, I did think he was actually going to play the 2 games in Game Week 25, but it's not the case. And in Game Week 26, I think it's very likely that we'll see him come back into the team. So it's not that I suddenly think that Ake's in, Pep jail or he's done anything wrong. The reality, of course, is that Man City do have a lot of capable defenders. And of course, we need to see exactly what's going on with Guardiola's injury. He might be back soon. But ultimately, of course, Ake was more a pick for the double. It didn't necessarily work out as planned. I hope, of course, that he can still do something well for managers in Game Week 26 or even Game Week 27. But of course, after that, that's where we will probably collectively see that a lot of the City defenders and City picks will probably drop within our estimations and value within our FPL teams. As far as Porro, I think it's just injury related. Same with Udogie as well. What I would like to say about these Tottenham players is that, once again, it's just the case of what strategy you're going for. If you're not planning to free it on 29, it actually makes a lot of sense to keep players like Porro and Udogie in your team, because they'll be serving you a huge service if they come back in Game Week 27, or at least if they just play in Game Week 29, which of course is a crucial fixture where you actually want someone with a good game, and Spurs are one of those teams. As far as Virgil, he gets a drop, and that's just, once again, the reality of, let's say, moving on from a double game week here. I think it's justifiable to move away from Virgil van Dijk. You could also keep him in your team because, as I said, if you can keep a Liverpool player beyond 30 plus, I think it's actually very justifiable to do so. So it really comes down to whether Virgil is, let's say, squeezing money from your team. I don't exactly know how he's going to perform versus Luton. My decision on him, of course, is just that you've got a Man City fixture on the horizon. You've got a very probable Game Week 29 blank. You're also got a blank in Game Week 26. So you can transfer Virgil out. I think it's perfectly fine to see, for example, double game week players as a 1 week punt, because sometimes the value of 2 fixtures or that one additional fixture, if you have a very high quality asset from a very good team, is that it could be worth a hit. It could be worth a transfer. And I think that's why I would always take that chance with someone like Virgil. But that's also why he falls, of course, now that double is over. Moving on lastly towards the goalkeepers, we have Neto rising towards the top of the rankings. That's simply because the double game week 28 is very close to the horizon now. If I was wildcarding, he would basically be my 100% locked in goalkeeper. The second goalkeeper would just be depending on your chip strategy. As far as Leno, he's actually, oddly enough, one of the goalkeepers that we think could play in Game Week 37 as double Game Week keeper, but the doubles that he would prospectively get are awful once again, and it kind of reminds me of Flecken. Yes, of course, you can bust out 9 saves within a match, but it's very likely you're also going to concede a lot of goals, and ultimately, if you look at the fixtures between the short term to the long term, it's not good enough to justify Leno being a good pick, and he's also very expensive, right, as a pick, considering his sort of position in terms of the XGC rankings, despite him being a good shot stopper. And I think when you compare it to some of the other goalkeepers here, you can see Areola, players like Flecken, even someone like, for example, Martinez here, who have given a rise. These are all players who are going to feature on Game Week 29. So with the goalkeeping aspect of things, I think it's once again questioning whether you actually want a goalkeeper who's actually going to play for you in the short term. And of course, keep in mind that someone like Raya as well will blank versus Brentford in Game Week 28 and also in Game Week 29, simply if we think that Leeds will still succumb to Chelsea in the FA Cup. So those sort of things are still in deliberation, right? Our valuation of keepers isn't set in stone. Kaminsky could actually even be a better pick for the same reason that I said Doughty could be very good, going to be, let's say, a player who could potentially play in Game Week 29 as well, depending on, let's say, Man United versus Nottingham Forest. So that's my thoughts in terms of goalkeepers. I think generally, as I said, if I'm going to leave something with you, it's just the small, simple nugget that I think sometimes, if you were to think about, let's say, a thought experiment, like let's say Saliba playing the 3 fixtures that he has, or for example, Odegaard with the 3 fixtures that he has, those sorts of players for those sorts of teams at those sorts of price points, maybe their 3 fixtures are better than other players who are very good already within FPL for 4 fixtures. And for me, that's a comparison of, let's say, Saliba versus an Aston Villa defender who still technically would be a good defense despite all the injuries, or let's say an Aston Villa midfielder or even a West Ham midfielder. So the comparison would be Bowen here or Douglas Luiz. I think that if you're investing into someone like Hwang as well, just because the fixtures are so good and you have something like Sheffield United at home, you have to sort of see that the amount of points that you can get from those players within 3 fixtures could very well match up or even exceed some of the sort of points that could be earned by some players within the next 4 game weeks. And so that's why I think it's not that important to think about getting 11 players in Game Week 29 or 11 players in Game Week 26. It's always going to be about how much you project really for certain points of players and how good they will be over a run of games, not necessarily with the amount of fixtures that they have. And I think, once again, for example, the Brentford doublers is a good example of that. I don't know how Luton will play tomorrow. I'm expecting them to do poorly, and I think that's also a good reflection of that. Whereas with Liverpool, I can even argue that, Jota for 45 minutes, Darwin for 45 minutes, Gakpo for 45 minutes, all of them did incredibly well. So think about, of course, what would have happened if they played a double game week, fully out. And that's all I have to say, really. So try to think a little bit about that. Don't get too bugged in terms of specific numbers like 11 for 29, 11 for 26. To me, that doesn't matter. It's about the players you have on the board and how that also coexists within your FPL strategy. So that's all I'm going to say before we actually leave on the video. Sorry for that long diatribe there, but I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to the members again for financially supporting this channel. Take care and goodbye, and I'll see you soon.